the worst arguments against the lockdowns were medical. To me, this was a freedom argument. That once you make something medical, once you tie freedom to what doctors or anyone thinks, you're saying that it's good, that there's a point at which people should take your freedom away from you. And I reject that. As I argue in the book, the more dangerous anything is, including a virus, the more superfluous is political action. Who needs to be forced to avoid sickness? Who needs to be forced to avoid something that might kill them? We chose in 2020 to crush the very economy that is the biggest enemy of death and disease the world has ever known. And I'm preaching to the choir, but historians will marvel at the abject stupidity of people in the political class. What bothered me was how many libertarians not only were fearful, okay, fine, be fearful, but that they were accepting of our freedom being taken. Or worse, they didn't say anything. I mean, you have the Cato Institute, which is is easily the most prominent institution in the world. And it's not, Cato took a powder. Some would say, and I think Jeffrey would say, that it did more. Cato actually supported the lockdowns, but how dare Cato be quiet about this? Regardless of individual views inside the organization, you stand up for freedom. That's why you're here. And Cato did nothing.
Hi, today is December 16, 2024. We managed to pass through Friday the 13th without much event. And well, I suppose there are always a lot of events going around. Maybe somebody can attribute them. I find actually nobody with a clearer view and focus on kind of redefining misattributions than John Tamny, an author and writer whom only recently I've uncovered. He's liked by George Gilder, and that's good enough for me. He's the president of the Parkview Institute, a libertarian, and the editor of Real Clear Markets. And he is real, from what I can tell, and he's pretty clear. He's going to elucidate a lot of, I guess, foibles, fallacies, I don't know, that people hold and cling to. And I'm happy and honored to have him on my show. John, thank you so much.
Randy, thank you so much for having me on. I'm flattered to be here.
Well, I mentioned to you in our green room that I've had on George Gilder twice. He's a brilliant man, and he has that, what I don't like to call it clairvoyance, because that has a separate kind of fortune teller aspect to it. But I like the word clairvoyance for clear sight and clear thinking. I'm not sure what that would be, clairprescience or something like that. But I think you have inherited it from him, and maybe the mantle will be passed from the great George Gilder to the up and coming John Tamny. And he wrote the introduction to your COVID book. Maybe we could start there and talk about, you're not a doctor. I'm not an economist. About maybe the confluence and the interface between those two fields and how it played out during COVID.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I keep arguing to doctors, including Jay Bhattacharya and some of the people who were nice enough to endorse the book, that the worst arguments against the lockdowns were medical. To me, this was a freedom argument. That once you make something medical, once you tie freedom to what doctors or anyone thinks, you're saying that it's good, that there's a point at which people should take your freedom away from you. And I reject that. As I argue in the book, the more dangerous anything is, including a virus, the more superfluous is political action. Who needs to be forced to avoid sickness? Who needs to be forced to avoid something that might kill them? And that's why I always say in speeches that the worst arguments made in favor of the lockdowns were the original ones. Most people turn it on their heads. They say, well, at first they didn't know. Well, precisely. That's why the arguments were so bad at first. They said, well, if we don't have our freedom taken away from us, if we can't go to work, and if they don't take away our right to go to work, to socialize and all that, that we will get sick and fill up hospitals that aren't ready for us. Well, I don't need to be forced to avoid that kind of thing. And then they said, well, 2.3 million Americans will die if they don't have their freedom taken from them. Well, what if it had been 50 million? What's the number? If it is 2.3 million, Americans would have locked themselves down on their own. They didn't need it forced on them by politicians. And so I just think it was a mistake always. Well, 97%, the CDC says this, that most people are dying in nursing homes. Well, what a dumb argument against the lockdowns. How about people are smart? They're the marketplace.
You make a great point. Over and over again, we had the, I guess through the 2000s and 2010s, the noughts and the teens, we had the Ebola threat. Ebola was going to hit our shores and do terrible, bad things. And that never transpired. And there's, we used to have the scales of justice. I'm not sure whether we still, operate those things where justice is blind and whatnot. But, generally there's kind of this balanced scale aspect between virulence, which is strength, danger of a virus or a threat or whatever, and transmissibility. And something that is, hugely virulent tends not to transmit as well because people die who have it. And they die quite quickly, and then other people react to it. It's a little bit like the kind of a bomb effect. You blow something up, and people don't hang around waiting for the second one. And so the Ebola threats never really manifest because it's Ebola. It's so big and bad. And to your point, they understand it. They want to get away from it. And if somebody looks a little bit queasy and sick, and they're about to kind of jettison on you, you get out of the way. And so I think that. And to your other point, people will make these accommodations on their own in reasonable, order. People react to threats that are far larger, and they tend to vote with their feet for a lot of other, ongoing threats, whether, economic and whatnot. People have been migrating one place or another throughout human history, and even before we even knew what history was.
Absolutely. And, it's so important that along these lines, the people are the market. And so people kept saying to me when they always say to me, well, when I point out the two worst excuses for the lockdowns, they always say, well, yeah, but you're smart and everything, and we're smart. And I say, well, when you say that, you're making my point. You need in the marketplace people making all sorts of good and bad decisions. That's how we find out if they're good and bad decisions. I know libertarians who never went into a restaurant for over a year once the virus starts. I don't understand it, but they did it. Okay, you need people like that. You need to find out if that worked. I have a wife, and she defends her actions during the lockdowns by saying that she just produced our second child. But we'd go for walks, as the well-to-do did, because they weren't supposed to be in the office anymore. And someone would walk past us on the sidewalk, and she'd jump out into the street and get mad at me for not doing the same. And you need people like that. You needed me to say I couldn't. The highlight of my day was going to the grocery store. I needed to be around people. And the minute restaurants open, indoors or outdoors, I was there. You needed me. You needed my 80-year-old parents out in Southern California saying, "There's no way you're locking us down. We're going to grocery stores. We're going to socialize. We're not going to wear masks." And you need young people most of all who will hit every bar and party and make out with everyone. They're your control group.
That's exactly right. That's a population experiment. I think this was so often ignored. We spent time, I think January 21 in Florida, Naples specifically, and so we've been to two Naples now, Italy and although they call it Napoli, and which actually means new city. Neapolitan means new city. We actually live in Newton, so we always like to think we live in Napoli, Massachusetts. But anyway, there we were in Naples, and for all the zombie apocalyptic aspects that were presented to us in Massachusetts, people were walking around just hunky dory, in basically in God's waiting room, Florida, which skews elderly, and those people who were skewing elderly at that very moment looked fine fettle, as they say, if that's still a thing. I'm not sure what other kind of fettles there are. But speaking to your point about somebody jumping on the pavement, I'm just going to interject this anecdote because I can. I live in a leafy suburb, and we have kind of wide streets that aren't that much driven, and I refuse to wear a mask unless, people twist my arms, tied me down, and literally in this case, gagged me. But at this point, I had my canine companion, was my only friend at that point, walking with me, and we're cruising down the middle of our street, and clearly, like, a couple, I don't know, 3-4 arms breadths away, 15, 20 feet away, on the sidewalk was a woman, and she saw me walking down the street with my dog, and she pointed like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like, horrified, because she's got her mask on. I mean, I suppose I can't intimate what her mouth was, but the rest of her, and she's like, starts backing up, because of the threat of me. And there's a tiny little bit of uneven grass, the berm where the sidewalk ends, and she trips over that, falls on her back, and she's there like an upside down crab, kind of backing away. So I go over to, because I figured maybe she broke something, whatever. I go over to help her. That was worse. And then that was when the real horror came over her, and she's like, no, she's like crawling backwards away. I'm like, okay, I get, whatever. She looks fine enough to get up, whatever. I walked away, never saw her again, as far as I know. But I think it was a kind of a interesting metaphor for that whole experience. I mean, this was already like in November of 2020 or something like that, and she was doing far worse damage to herself potentially by the trip and the fall and the horror,
Yes.
and the apoplexy, whatever, of the whole incident, than anything that I would have transmitted to her, or that she could have had transmitted to her in general, because she was, even though she was probably 67, 8 years old, clearly she had survived so far, and unlikely she was going to get knocked over by the virus, whatever. But the whole threat and the ambiance of it was otherworldly.
Mm-hmm. So much of that. And again, and my point was, I still see people wearing masks today, and I say, gosh, why are they doing it? But wear your masks if you want. I don't care. What I care about is when people foist their views on me, because remember, the line was, well, because you don't want to wear a mask, you're being selfish. I'm saying, no. You're the selfish one. You are foisting your insecurities on me. You don't have to be around me. You don't have to go out at all. Just don't do to me what you want to do to yourself. But I wanted people to make choices, because that's how you learn. The people are the marketplace, but the marketplace was muzzled in 2020. They locked us all down. And in doing so, they blinded us to what we were supposed to know about the virus, rather than providing clarity for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's the obvious one. I think it's the second chapter of my book, where I just talk about a very brief history of medicine, just to point out to people that, when we were a poor nation, if you broke your hip, you died. If you broke your femur, you had 1 in 3 chances of death. Cancer killed you, of course, but see, most people didn't get cancer in the 19th century because tuberculosis and pneumonia killed you so quickly. We live longer because of wealth creation, providing physicians and scientists with the resources necessary to find out what can make us well when we're not well. We chose in 2020 to crush the very economy that is the biggest enemy of death and disease the world has ever known. And I'm preaching to the choir, but historians will marvel at the abject stupidity of people in the political class.
Yeah, there are two things that kind of came to mind as you were speaking. First of all, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Grok, whatever you happen to use, if any, for these artificial intelligence models, they're LLM, they're large language models. Well, you know what else is a large language model? Us. We are a large language model. We have lots of people talking, and that's exactly how we have our internet of humanity. Before there was ever internet, we had it in a web, a net of people, and people benefited from talking to each other. If you go throughout Europe, there's a lot of same time buildings that have a certain look, but they're all across the continent. Well, how did that happen? It's like, well, the French may have built something, and then everybody else said, oh, look at that. And they passed plans across, and, the Romans, all roads led to Rome. They probably still do throughout a fair part of Europe. And their building techniques went all throughout the known world to them at the time. So you'll see Roman, arches and aqueducts and whatever, in Turkey, and what is now Turkey and whatnot. But it's like, this is exactly the template for civilization. And civilization has been the antidote, or the prophylaxis, or the vaccine to most of our illnesses. Without boring you too much, I'm working on a book on kind of reformulating cancer. People think that it's a lot of cancers are their fault. How the cancer-free diet, how they're going to prevent cancer by doing exercise. Well, a lot of it these days is stochastic. It's just kind of a random event, and we're so good at finding a lot of stuff that people don't die from. And breast cancer is probably the most common female cancer, and prostate the most common male, but people don't really die from either of those very much, for a variety of reasons I'm not going to delve into. But one of the things I worked on for one of the chapters was current title is like refrigerators and reindeer, and it goes over the fact that 100 years ago the most common form of cancer in the United States, deadly cancer, was stomach cancer. And I practiced primary care medicine for 30 odd years, and some of them were odd. But I almost never saw a case of stomach cancer, and I don't think I had anybody die from stomach cancer for that duration. This was the single most common killer. Well, what happened was refrigeration. It was electrification in the 20s and 30s. We weren't eating, food to the same extent as rancid. The whole essence of spicy food throughout the tropics is it's probably hiding the fact that your meat, was not that great. So you don't really have that, taste sensation. Your taste buds are numbed and so forth. So barring that, people had better food and they lived longer. So, and the reindeer part has to do with, something not really cancer, but, the fact that Viagra, probably saved the reindeer. That people weren't, killing the aphrodisiac, appearing animals, various sharks and whatnot for their teeth, and reindeer for their horns and whatnot, so they could get horny, and so these are the kind of the byproducts of technology in a sense, and Viagra itself was serendipitous because it was a heart medication, an anti-anginal that was repurposed, and again through communication became something that really changed the world. I mean, I think if Adolf Hitler had availed to Viagra, we might not have seen the World War apocalypse and so forth. But so I think a lot of these things can be ameliorated through means that, again, were not intentional. They're not public health measures, and I think you point to a lot of that stuff that So I'll stop yammering, but the question I have for you is, does public health work, and what is public health, and when did it last work, and is it just kind of a named byproduct or something else? Is it riding on the train of general economic progress, and then declaring itself the engine?
It's such a good question, and when I came on with you, I kept thinking, okay, I've got all these questions for the doctor afterwards. Because I'm convinced, because I'll ask you the question now, and you can answer part of the question afterwards. I follow economics, but see, I'm not an economist. And I always tell people, don't you dare call me an economist, because I've never been around people more just divorced from any semblance of reality. I mean, these guys actually believe that war stimulates economic growth. I mean, that's how bad they think growth causes inflation. I mean, let you go on and on and on. And so I say this, and people say, well, it's the bad schools. I say, no. People just believe, people are simplistic, and a lot of simplistic people would actually take 5 years to get a degree in economics. What I'm getting at you with the question is, I wanted to ask you, I am terrified of doctors because I witnessed this again in 2020. There's so often they think the same thing, and there's not a lot of original thought. I want the doctor who's a skeptic, who's a contrarian, because the doctors in economics, most of them aren't contrarians, and they think the most ridiculous things. So I would ask you, do you know anyone in Washington, D.C. who can be my primary care physician? Because I don't trust anyone anymore, and I don't trust them to tell me what to do. Yeah. And so that's my question. And I ask you that, but then I also ask you, how did you have the courage to push back against the orthodoxy? And my point there is, I think a lot of doctors felt like they had to protect their careers.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to have to take the recommendation one offline. We can talk about that separately for finding you a doctor. But I have I kind of have this cowboy gene or something like that. I mean, I have always wanted to think through and try to do things according to, I was a chemistry and physics major in college, so I'm not necessarily your typical physician type, and I'm more of a math guy. I scored well and so forth. Maybe the tests are wrong, but I try to think along the lines of Occam's razor, and oftentimes the simplest solution is the best, and I think people make a lot of extra scribbles on the color it in thing without working it out as well. I think I try to kind of go back to first principles and think absent doctors, how do people do, and a lot of situations will self attenuate. And I just think that it has to be enough trust about that. As far as people take all kinds of nutraceuticals and whatnot, and maybe they're on the margin some things that are reasonable. But I try to think that your basic raccoon, and wolf, and I don't know, squirrels and birds and whatnot. They don't have GNC. They don't have nutraceuticals. They don't buy stuff. They, pretty much map out, and it's been mapped out for them. And the accommodation of, evolution and, working through your environments, that they these are things that keep them alive. And obviously the ipso facto it has. So, I think that, people keep kind of misplacing the parameters by which they judge success. We have these simple numbers like, how long did you live? Well, you don't know that answer yet, so neither of us can really predict that. We've seen, kind of population people, have a higher number for that. But the question is, in the short term, I've trotted this anecdote. So anybody who's listened to this before, I apologize. But, I often think that people are misjudging their success by longevity per se. It comes down to I was listening to this little reel where somebody's talking about time kind of subjectively, that time stretches and dilates and is more concentrated. And it wasn't really a science point he was trying to make. It's like the things you remember. You might remember your kid's wedding. You might remember, childbirth. You might remember your marriage, so forth. Those are the few seconds of life that kind of suffuse you with pleasure. And when you have your life, if you spent your life doing nothing and you live to 150, is that the same as being Winston Churchill, who actually did live quite a long time, but have the experiences and the moments where you're making crucial decisions. So just the anecdote, very brief, is I was in the before times, when there were cocktail parties and whatnot in maybe it's 2017 or 18. I was happened to be standing near the food, and because good place to be, and there was beef satay, steak on a stick, and this guy about my age is kind of like staring at it like a puppy outside a bakery, and for a good length of time, a couple minutes, whatever. And I kind of nudged over to him and I said, let me just, I apologize, but the way I'm looking at you is that you're thinking about that steak. You would love to have it, but it's going to change your cholesterol a couple points, and whatever. But really, if it does in fact change your life expectancy one way or another, it's probably going to be a few minutes, and that's when you're 90. And you're not going to really know about those minutes because you're going to be, blanket sitting in a nursing home, maybe staring at the sunset if you're lucky. And in the meanwhile, you've kind of wasted those 5 minutes by staring at it being, why don't you have it, enjoy it? And these will be the 5 minutes you remember. I was briefer than that. But basically he was like, like, wow, how did you do that? Like a little Penn and Teller, magic trick. And he had the beef and he loved it. And we chatted about that, obviously. But it's like, the moments you have, I don't recommend you follow through on every, proclivity or interest or twitch that goes through the brain. But there are certainly things that you have to think about that are going to construct your world so that you're actually, having moments that count without sounding too hallmarky. That those are the things. And to another point, as we live longer as society, we have less childbirth. These are kind of an inimical thing. If I came up with this idea just yesterday, talking with Dr. Robert Malone, and if you came up with a plague that would kind of diminish your country's population by, I don't know the numbers, but let's say 20% over the next 15 years, you'd be like, oh my God, that's a horrible, horrible thing. That's worse than any heart disease. But that's what's happening to places that have a 0.8 child per woman. Like South Korea is just disappearing itself, and it's not through nuclear war. It's through kind of societal malaise, to quote it's our most famous centenarian, Jimmy Carter. And it's like, so I think, health has to do with, kind of more things than we just measure through blood pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it was fascinating to see. I just think there's uh, not a lot of original thinking out there, and it's the original thinkers who propel society forward. I mean, to me, that was the underlying point of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, that the quote criminals were, in fact, they're not criminals, the people stealing. They were just the oddballs who think differently. And if you don't have them, you don't progress in 2020. If you had the temerity. Now, to be clear, I didn't think I was courageous for fighting against the lockdowns. What I'm getting, I mean, I've just always been I don't choose to be who I am. It's who I am. But what some libertarian friends of mine and I said is that some doctors, we felt like they had to go with the flow because it was dangerous to not to perhaps within that profession. I don't think I'm courageous. I think some doctors had to be. I'd like to think that I would have been that way if I had been in the field, because again, for leaving medicine aside, the notion that people would give up their freedom or that governments would take our freedom was just too offensive to contemplate. Not happening, and especially not in a country like the United States that was created by people who so badly wanted a taste of freedom they crossed oceans, risking their lives and borders to get it. No thanks. Don't do that to me.
Yeah. So libertarians, it sounds like there's liberty right in the beginning of that word, but I am grateful to be friends with a great libertarian, Jeffrey Tucker, who took the pathway of saying no and fighting. And I write for brownstone.org, and it's a great organization, institution, and I suppose magazine, if you want to call it that. But there's so many libertarians who should kind of hand in their cards if libertarians had them. Because I always, let me see if I get his name right. Is it Nassim Nicholas Taleb, or anyway, some order of those names? That guy, great black swan genius. He's on the plane with I'm exaggerating, 5 masks, but I think there were easily 2 or 3, maybe in goggles as well. And not only that, but posting it on social media. It's like almost bad enough that you have that. It turns out that you're not necessarily the general in battle that you thought you were on the sidelines. But to post that and brag about it, it seems to me like, well, how it kind of like makes me harken back, like how good were you at reading other stuff if that's the way you read this? How well did you read the other rooms if this is what your conclusion was? Your book talks about what's his name, Fred Smith's FedEx experience in Wuhan in 2019 or early 2020. That people were, his collection of drivers, had no great disability, whatever. They were driving around, and how well is an economist libertarian such as Taleb, understanding what's going on if he misreads the basic input data?
Yeah, it staggers the mind. I mean, again, I'll say again, look, if people are fearful of something, be fearful. You're the market. You're part of the market, so do that. What bothered me was how many libertarians not only were fearful, okay, fine, be fearful, but that they were accepting of our freedom being taken. Or worse, they didn't say anything. I mean, you have the Cato Institute, which is easily the most prominent institution in the world, and it's not. Cato took a powder. Some would say, and I think Jeffrey would say, that it did more. Cato actually supported the lockdowns, but how dare Cato be quiet about this? Regardless of individual views inside the organization, you stand up for freedom. That's why you're here. And Cato did nothing. What's the Students for Liberty did nothing. They supported it. So many entities did next to nothing or supported the taking of freedom. They should, at the very least, they should give back the money that was given to them by their hardworking donors, including Fred Smith. Fred Smith's a huge donor to the Liberty movement. And in 2020, the Libertarians acted horribly.
I agree. So, it's like herding cats. You can't organize libertarians, and I assume there's no test. What do you think is going on here? Everyone always used to wonder, like how they would operate around Anne Frank, how they would, resist. Everyone's part of the resistance, in their World War II, imaginings, and they would fight the Nazis and they'd be Bonhoeffer and whatnot. I think everybody, for the most part, was not. They were all ready to, kind of jump on, and it carries on. I mean, I was assaulted a couple times, for not punched, but for saying things that were contrary to the thought, to the main line, and these are by people with credentials and whatnot. It's there's this kind of huge power thing going, and also I don't know. It's just I'm just kind of shocked at when there's so much information. We carry these computers around with us everywhere, and it's got the Library of Congress and more, and yet people don't. They have, I guess, kind of an essential laziness, or I don't know. Is it just kind of a group thing, kind of team identification? It's safer. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk to kind of the animal roots or the kind of innate aspects of humanity. But what do you think? What do you think is operating when something like this happens, a calamity? I mean, we see it, in the universities, during the Hamas, or after the Hamas incursion in Israel, October 7, a year ago. A lot of things that people thought were truthful. Obviously truthful that, they had the GoPro cameras and they did X, Y, and Z, and then people deny all that. So I've kind of divided the world up into this, this little box, like you're right about COVID, wrong about Hamas, kind of thing. I mean, how do people kind of filter their news? Or I think it's sort of just a team sport in a way. And then how do we determine the teams? I mean, I think the teams somewhat, rejiggered between COVID and the what I call the Hamassacre. I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we kind of formulate our opinions based on groups.
Well, it's what I always say in speeches to libertarians and Republicans. I always say it's really easy to be for freedom when the world is tranquil, but we don't need you then. We need you when things are uncertain, when there's a lack of tranquility. And it's a real problem I have with libertarians and Republicans. I think I pointed out in the book, but I pointed out in other books, there was no financial crisis in 2008. There's never a crisis when markets are creating information.
Mm-hmm.
The crisis was one of intervention that Republicans and libertarians either supported or they were quiet about. And so we had a crisis as a consequence of politicians substituting their narrow knowledge for that of the marketplace. What was 2020 but another example? The virus has been spreading for months, maybe longer. Who knows when it began spreading? And people were responding. They were responding in different ways. As I point out in the book, because the New York Times showed this to me, the red states, the free people in the red states, the science deniers, they responded most quickly to the virus with masks, whatever it is. You don't have to like their response, but they were responding to it. Then government got involved and they created a crisis. Well, of course they did. Fauci could be the smartest guy on earth, but he's not smarter than the marketplace, because the marketplace is collective knowledge. And every time our side supports or gets out of the way when politicians basically muzzle and suffocate all this knowledge. And so, yeah, I think far more people are libertarian than realize, but they've got to recognize that this is an ideology that's tailor-made for, quote, crises. And if you apply it, there won't be crises because you'll allow markets to work when they're most needed.
Mhm. I like that. So my friend Jim Malone recommended you to me, and his favorite article I'm going to put up here so people can see it, um, of yours, that is opposite what you're told. Rising ignorance is very bullish. So this will be a little bit of our kind of a fork in the road for us. Maybe it's not. Tell us what you mean by this, and I'd love to have a conversation over this topic, because one of my it's not quite the same thing, but so many times at parties, actually it happened just a couple days ago, the concept that Americans are so ignorant because we only speak one language. My grandfathers both spoke multiple languages, but it wasn't necessarily out of happiness or desire or intellectual pursuit. It's because they were shut between places. They had to move between places, or there were opposing armies, kind of sweeping through, and then they had to learn. So, and it's like, there was no lingua franca per se in Middle Europe, or if, as far as there was, it was by force, whatever. So, I always say, well, if we haven't, if we were born in Kazakhstan, I would want to learn American English. If I were born in, I don't know, you pick the country, Burkina Faso, whatever, I'd want to learn American English. It just so happens I was born in the U.S., so I already know it. And if I had to, have my kids learn another language, at the time it would be Python, or whatever, the more modern equivalent is. It's like, anyway, I'll put this back up again so people can kind of reacquaint with the title here. But tell us what you mean by this.
Well, what I mean is that progress is defined by what we don't need to learn, not what we learn. We don't know how to farm anymore. Well, thank goodness for that. I don't know how to change the oil on a car, and I certainly couldn't change a tire. But historically, you kind of needed to know those things, right? Because cars broke down a lot. It used to be that we had to know how to grow food because farming was the profession for the vast majority of us. What we don't need to learn means that we can learn new things. I mean, it's so interesting to me that, again, libertarians, they talk endlessly and with good reason. Comparative advantage, free trade. We focus on what we do best. I agree 1,000%. But the minute they read about how, well, American kids are really doing bad on math tests, or they're not doing well on English, suddenly it's crisis. And you know what? They also don't know who the people on the Supreme Court are. They don't know who the president is. Oh my God, what are we going to do? I'm thinking, but you know what they do know? They know how to get on Google to find that information. I don't know what it means to them once they find it.
Mm-hmm.
But precisely, of course, we don't need to know that stuff. And it doesn't matter. We just as we free trade, we focus on what we do best. We learn what we need to know on the path to immense happiness and prosperity. It's a bullish thing. But you try to convince our crowd, they say, oh no, look at these test scores. We got to do, let's have vouchers. Let's have a government program to make sure that kids are getting a better education. Oh, stop it.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. I know one of my son's telephone numbers because it's easy. It ends with a significant, 4-digit number that I know for other reasons. And the other one, I think I know it. I don't always get it right because it's a gobbledygook of just random numbers. And I don't really have any reason ever to use it. I've never dialed his number. We don't. First of all, it's a kind of funny thing that we say. It's an anachronism to even to say dial. There's no dial.
Yes.
So people don't roll down their windows. There's no reason to roll down your windows. I drive a Tesla now, and I just push a little button. I say open glove box. I don't even have to know how to open the glove box, and I'm not sure there is a way to open the glove box aside from, going on the computer screen or dictating it. This is a wonderful thing. There's somebody wrote a while ago, the worldwide robot. I think I read this maybe 15, 20 years ago. People always want robots to come and, kind of like, Lost in Space, Will Robinson, how can I help you, whatever. But the robot is amorphous. The fact is the matter, I could sit. There's a kid's book I loved as a kid, and I read it to my kids. I think it's a big ball of string, and this kid's sick, and he's sitting in the room, and he doesn't know what to do with himself. He can't get out of bed. Anyway, somehow he can't leave his room. He has a big ball of string, and he's able to like get all the things he wants to in the room, and he's got all these pulleys. I don't know. It's a kid's book, but the fact of the matter is he's able to action, and if that's a verb, activate all kinds of manners of things within his world by sitting in one place. Well, we can do that right now. You have your robot, same, I brought my prop with me, the same device. I can pretty much get pizza, like any variety. And I could probably get some bananas here. And I could probably get friends to show up here without, leaving with my big ball of string. And I can get to the airport. I can get somebody I've never met to drive me to the airport, and I can get on a plane all without really any human interaction at all. And I could be, you and I could meet someplace, and we could find each other in a crowd. We could find each other. If I even brought my robot with me, we wouldn't be able to do that. One of the sons I was mentioning, he and I were in France last year, or this year, I guess, and we just kind of went our separate ways oftentimes. And then, using, the fine point GPS, we found each other in the middle of huge crowds. And it's just an incredible thing. So it's kind of an irony that, kind of people, I hate to say the B word, but they whine, starts with a B, ends in which. They whine a lot about how horrible things are, but I think some of it has to do with the skew of kind of, we spend these longer lives, and therefore we spend far more of our lives than younger set populations ever did, not being able to jump a fence, or not being able to be perfectly healthy where you can run around. So we kind of have these aches and pains and whatnot, and we're just never satisfied. But it's an incredible panoply of cornucopia like wishes and dreams we have, if we just care to activate them. But having stuff oftentimes is makes it too easy. We have, I think, a kind of degree of difficulty aspect. You have to, I don't know how it goes. Maybe societally, people need to make things tougher for themselves. I don't know. They're not satisfied.
People want it to be. They imagine that progress is defined by how difficult things are. I mean, my favorite, it's not just, oh, isn't it terrible? Young people don't know anything. Well, my other favorite is that young people, they're going to earn less than we did, and they may not live as well as their parents, and they're so spoiled and everything. I'm like, have you ever heard something more bullish? Wait, so they're really spoiled? Yeah, that's a sign of progress. That's a bullish thing. Wait, they get married later. They start their careers later. Again, signs of progress. In the past, you find me a society where people are going backwards, where actually they have less. And I will show you one in stupendous decline. We can go all over Africa right now, and we can find people that have never seen cars before, that have never seen motorcycles. Well, yeah, see, we see all of that, and we see so much more. Of course we're entitled, because all we know is progress. I don't ever want to see the day when Americans aren't entitled.
Well, that's a good point. And the COVID, getting back a little bit to the COVID experience, there was this, you point out that 100 years ago, if it had been 1920, and we of course did have the Spanish flu, whatever you want to call it. It was actually, I think, a Chinese flu. They called the Spanish flu. And if coronavirus had come around, I actually made the same example over and over again during the early stages, the dark stages of COVID, when I took to Facebook Live and had my weekly fireside chat urged by some of my Facebook friends. But I don't think coronavirus would have been a big deal. I would much rather have had SARS-CoV-2 absent any prophylactic vaccine than have had 1918 H1N1 absent any prophylactic vaccine. They didn't have vaccines then for flu. I'm not sure they understood viruses as a concept back then either. But that one skewed towards the young, and coronavirus clearly, insofar as it gets people is elderly. So I much rather have had SARS-CoV-2. But even so, you point out kind of the counterfactual world. What if we didn't test this? And I frankly think that that's where we should be now. We really quite early into SARS-CoV-2 experience, I think we should have stopped testing. It becomes its own manufactured den of horrible distorted mirrors. And I'm wondering whether you might want to speak to your example of 1920 SARS-CoV-2.
Well, I would actually want to speak to my 2000 example. What if it had revealed itself in 2000? There's not a chance that there's a lockdown then, because in 2000, most of us couldn't work from home very easily. And so the elites would never have given up their own jobs for it. And believe me, I'm not saying this as an anti-rich person. I trust me on that. But I'm saying the vast majority of us needed to go to a place to work. The vast majority of us didn't have Netflix at the time, so we could stream TV all day. The vast majority of us did not have Facebook. Well, none of us had it. Facebook, so we could keep in touch with friends, and Zoom and all the things that rich people and middle class and poor people did to remain in touch. And arguably most important of all, we didn't have Uber Eats, so we could tell those subhumans who did need to work and had to be out and about working to just leave the bag at the doorstep. Don't touch the door. Don't touch anything in our house, but just leave. Let us know that you dropped the food off. We couldn't have functioned in 2000 in these hideous lockdowns. And so that's one of my biggest fears. This technological progress is only going to get better, and thumbs up to that. What if they try to lock us down in 2050? It's going to be even easier to do it. And that's why Americans need to be vigilant. No, just don't ever, ever, ever give up your freedom, because their ability to do it will grow and grow and grow, not just because it's so much easier to step away for a time and not have to step away.
So I've had on Aaron Day, who is a Brownstone Fellow, and his concern and worry is this CBDC, central bank digital currency. I always try to think of it as CBD, cannabis. I wonder if you have thoughts about that as far as, kind of getting everyone on the worldwide registry.
Oh, gosh. I tease Jeffrey about this all the time, that he and his Austrian crowd, they're so obsessed with central banks. This isn't me defending the Fed. I've written books about the Fed, making fun of it. I've probably written more articles that ridicule economists at the Fed than anyone alive. But come on, what do we know about the history of governments with money? Is they always devalue. And so if the Fed creates a central bank digital currency, so what? Will it be better than the dollar created by the federal government? That, it's the best currency in the world, arguably, but it's been devalued a lot over the years. How would this be different? The reality is, at least to me, and I argue it in my book number 6 about money, is that of course it's going to be a private entity that creates the actual crypto monies that actually circulate. And it will, simply because governments have always devalued. Maybe a private issuer won't. I think the odds are greater that a private issuer won't.
So I kind of I'm going to have to re-listen to that and digest it. So when you talk about the devaluing part, this is it because government keeps issuing more money than is really necessary for?
No, that's a big myth. They always say government creates more money than the market. Please. So all that time when the dollar had a stable value as 1/35 of a gold ounce or 1/20th, was the Fed acting as croupier, adding and subtracting dollars from the economy? Money circulating in the economy is a function of production. That's why there's lots of money in Newton mass and very little money in historically now Chester. Wait, let me think. There's very little money in, I don't know, Bridgeport, Connecticut. That's not because the Fed puts a lot in one place and very little in the other. Where there's production, there's money. And so I don't think it's that. I just think historically governments in 1933, FDR just decided the dollar is now worth 1/35 of an ounce of gold. It used to be 1/20. And he said, oh, by the way, if I change my mind, I'll change my mind on the value of the dollar any day I want to. The Fed was very against this, by the way. The Fed Chair Eugene Meyer was so against what FDR did that he resigned and bought the Washington Post to fight the inflationary tendencies of the president. The Fed was powerless in this. In 1971, the Fed begged Richard Nixon, Fed Chair Arthur Burns begged Nixon not to take us off the gold standard. But Nixon did anyway, because that was his power. That was the power of the U.S. Treasury. Fed was powerless. And as a consequence, the dollar was devalued. And so currency stability is a choice. It's a policy choice. This currency will be stable. We will back it in such a way, whether it's by gold or we'll peg it to something. Sometimes governments don't do it. Sometimes we haven't done it. And as a consequence, it loses value because that's the policy. But governments can never, this is something the Austrians keep mistaking. They keep saying governments can force money into the economy. They can boost the money supply. They can do no such thing. Where there's production, there's money. Where there's no production, there's very little money.
But there is this quantitative easing. I call it printing money. The government does that. If I were playing Monopoly, our families get together, we play Monopoly. If suddenly, somebody were to dump, an extra, couple, 3, 4 games worth of Monopoly amongst the players, then whenever something, some property, I don't know if we actually auction things in Monopoly, but let's say there, was an auction feature to buy these properties that wind up in the middle. You're going to be able to spend, 3 times as much if you have 3 times as much game money. There has to be, there's some aspect where, like for instance, during COVID, where, there was no production going on and they kept printing money, as it were. Maybe, I have the terms wrong. So the dollar as a result inflates, I assume.
But they weren't printing money.
Okay.
They just weren't. If you look during COVID, the dollar didn't decline at all. And people say, well, foreign currencies were bad. Okay, well, the dollar was rising versus gold.
So how are they paying people all these pips, these various payments, to kind of, keep their businesses alive when they weren't producing anything? Where did that money come from? And we look at the deficit went up. So instead of printing money, they were borrowing money. You tell me, How did it work out?
Well, because the U.S. is backed by the most productive people on earth. Of course we can borrow. But think about that. What was the yield on the Treasury during COVID? Again, this isn't me defending borrowing or government spending. I think they're a huge tax on production, and huge tax on liberty. But the yield on the 10-year Treasury was 3% then, as debt soared. The yield in 1980, when total national debt was $900 billion, the yield was 11%. Well, this was 3% then. Why? Because the world lines up to loan to us. I think quantitative easing was an abomination, but let's be clear, that was just the Fed borrowing from banks. Banks were terrified to make bad loans. Banks can't sit on the money that's in their care. They have to do something with it. This is something Keynesians and Austrians don't understand, but banks can't sit on the money. And so the Fed said, okay, we'll borrow it from you. So the Fed borrowed it and bought treasuries. Dumb idea. But the money was going to flow into the economy either way. The dollar circulates because people are productive. If it ever becomes the case that the U.S. Treasury is actually reliant on the Fed to print, trust me, there's not a number high enough to reflect the interest rates on U.S. Treasuries. They'd go skyrocketing because markets would know this. They would know this well ahead of the printing, that, oh, wow, they're not just running out of money. They don't have any new money coming in because Americans aren't productive anymore. And
so during that year, 2020, when production, went down precipitously, what happened to money, the value of money thereafter? I mean, we have had the biggest inflation we've had since centenarian Jimmy Carter and the early years of his, successor, Ronald Reagan. and I don't want to lose sight of the fact of what Aaron Day is pointing out through Brownstone about CBDC. He's talking about the fact that everyone's going to be tagged for their transactions, and it's going to be like a a registry that people, the government can spy on you even further. So that was the other aspect of CBDC claim. So I don't want to lose track of that. But my point, and you've written about inflation quite a bit, and I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on what brought about this kind of greater inflation we've had these last, say, 3 years?
Well, it wasn't inflation, and I know I'm alone, but Jim Malone told you that I disagree with everyone on everything.
That's fine. I'm happy. I'm here to learn.
Yeah. So let's just go back to first principles. Let's go back to Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. What does he open the book up with? The pin factory. One man working alone in a pin factory could maybe produce 1 pin per day. But 5 to 10 men working together in that same factory, working in specialized fashion, could create tens of thousands of pins per day. So think back to 2020. You suddenly have governments around the world shutting down economic activity, as in, Gavin Newsom was telling factories in California, or if you open up, I'm going to cut off electricity to you. Is it any surprise that prices are higher in the aftermath of that? And this isn't me saying supply fell out of whack with demand. By definition, supply mirrors demand. We produce, hence we can consume. But when you break up cooperative production relationships that had been built up over decades and break them up for months, by definition, prices are going to be higher in the aftermath. And it bothers me so much. And I've gotten on Jeffrey about this. I've gotten on left, right, center. When you're calling this inflation, the higher prices, you're basically saying you didn't build that, but right-wing version. Of course prices are higher. We broke up cooperative relationships that were a miracle. Prices were low before the lockdowns because of a miracle of global cooperation of hands and machines. And then you just kind of break it up over several months. You can't put that back together right away. It's going to take years. And so we have higher prices, but there's an ocean of difference between higher prices and inflation, because higher prices by definition signal lower prices elsewhere. You can, unless economics is not about trade-offs. If I'm spending more on apples and Starbucks coffee or whatever, I have fewer dollars to buy other things. But see, the difference is command and control is not inflation. It's command and control. And so I get so mad at our side. And I've gotten mad at Jeffrey about this. I've said, look at what you're doing. You are giving politicians exactly what they want. You are saying this is about the Federal Reserve because Austrians think all of our illnesses come from the Fed, when in fact, this is a direct consequence of our freedom being taken and our not being able to produce together as the world once did. Politicians will love you to do that because it takes the pressure. Suddenly it's about the Fed. No, the biggest driver of prices going lower is global cooperation. It's the pin factory writ large that we broke up, that politicians broke up. So of course prices are higher. The only way to get them down is not for the Fed to fiddle with interest rates. I mean, imagine our side supporting more government intervention after the tragic interventions in 2020. The path to lower prices is to let free people rebuild what these morons broke. And so it wasn't inflation.
Fair enough.
Look at the dollar between 2021 and 2020. They keep, look, Biden's a moron. Settled science. You got me there. And I'm not a defender of Biden. Of course, he's just hopeless. But the notion that guy caused an inflation, what about all the government spending under Donald Trump? Where was the inflation then? What caused the higher prices was the breaking up of the global economy. And look at the dollar when Biden got into office. If you look at the gold price, which is to me the only objective way to look at it, the dollar was rising. But it didn't matter who was going to be in office. We were going to have higher prices, and it was a function of what happens.
So what happened under Biden that brought the greater inflation? It's just the aftermath of the kind of the breakup of the relationship.
Yeah, Biden just he had bad timing. Those prices were going up no matter what.
Right.
And I guarantee you, if Trump had been in office, a lot of these people would be saying, they'd be using my argument that, well, a high price by definition means a lower price elsewhere. Prices are naturally going to be higher for a long time because we broke up the global economy. But because everything's got to be politicized, including inflation, we're seeing the opposite.
Well, I would kind of push back slightly on the giving Biden a timing pass, because he extended the COVID idiocy much longer than needed to have been.
Okay, agreed. Okay, you got me. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah. So let me ask you a separate question then. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar. There are lots of kind of crazy inflations that have happened over time. We have the benefit of being the world's reserve currency and the place that everyone wants to be, essentially, and we can be both the tail that wags the dog and to a certain extent the dog itself wagging its own tail. And so people will still want to flock to us. They'll still want to buy our currency, which kind of keeps it valued higher perhaps than it otherwise would be. But if you have Zimbabwe, what brings their crazy massive inflation? Venezuela, ditto. Is it just merely the deconstruction of the previous underpinnings of the economy, or is the fact again that they are kind of priming the pump and pouring more quote unquote dollars, kind of changing the monopoly pool that the game, the Parker Brothers game pool of funds around, that's such that there's so many dollars that they are devalued?
Good question. The first thing I would say is we don't. I think there's a myth about how we've got what's the guy Jacques Rueff said, that we've got exorbitant privilege. No, we don't. Look at the 1970s. Look at how the cost of borrowing rose substantially for the U.S. Treasury then, as Treasury yields went up. If you look at Venezuela, Weimar Germany, all those examples, what you find is that the devaluation happened, hence the excess of that money. And what's important about that is, and so people say, well, no, money printing and everything causes the inflation. No, it doesn't. Money printing is an effect of inflation. Think about it. Look at what happened in Weimar Germany. They were devaluing starting in 1914 more and more. They were looking for they wanted their way out of their debt for a number of things. But what you saw happen is all that money printing, the money didn't flow into the economy. The mark disappeared. In Germany during the 1920s, dollars were everywhere. Dollar booths were sprouted up throughout Berlin because you wouldn't take a mark for something. Oh, Dr. Bach, I'll pay you in marks. You'll say, oh, no, you won't, because you want something equal in return for what you want equal value. So the dollar became, and trusted currencies, but dollar first and foremost became the currency of Germany. In Venezuela right now, the dollar is the primary currency there. The bolivar is so devalued, it's disappeared. In Zimbabwe, the same thing. You go if you go to North Korea today and you want to buy things, you better have dollars. You better have them in Iran too. And so people they turn inflation on its head.
So what happens in Iran, Zimbabwe, Venezuela that say is not happening in, I don't know, Chile or Colombia or Pakistan or whatever, relatively nearby places to all those things, and contemporaneously that makes it happen in A, not in B? I mean, what's going on in those places, Zimbabwe, that's not happening in South Africa?
Well, because currency stability is a choice. Once again, you either have it or you don't. It's either your policy that this currency.
Okay, so just get to the kind of the action moment. What's the defining moment of decision that the leaders or either make or have put upon them to value it? In your view, what's the actual switch there?
The defining moment is you either have a standard or you don't.
Okay, so tell me what that is. Please define what's the moment.
I think historically, money just had a commodity definition. The U.S. dollar is still trusted, but clearly it's not trusted like it once was. And how you know that is that there were no currency markets before 1971. Currency markets are a modern concept. There was not, people did not trade dollars and other currencies before 1971. The dollar is the world's currency. It circulates around the world. This is what the Austrians miss, is they assume that the Fed just pumps all these dollars. No, the dollar's everywhere. That's the surest sign that the Fed's not money printing and all the things that Austrians imagine. The dollar is used everywhere. But people have a trust but verify aspect to it. They are very clear about it, that the dollar can only and you see it in the currency markets. George Giller points this out. There's $7 trillion, $10 trillion worth of currency trading every day. That is the market saying they still want those standards that used to exist. And because they don't have them, there's all this trade. There's this hedging of currency risk.
Okay, so let's say you became, or you might already be, a currency trader. What would be your prospective play, leaving kind of country names apart? Let's say you had to choose between only the countries of South America, and what would be the things that you'd look at today from country to country that indicate kind of this greater respect for the sanctity of their currency or whatever? What are the things, the tools, the objects? Is it borrowing? Is it spending? I guess obviously we have an outlier in Argentina. How would things be playing out in your mind if you had to? And I'm not looking for investment advice per se, more kind of the things that you're looking at that determine this, because a lot of it seems to me kind of, the thing is a thing because it's a thing we define it as a thing. We have kind of this USA focus because we are really different from these other countries. How does it play out, USA notwithstanding, between countries that from the outside may not have that, great gross discernible differences to us?
Oh gosh. So how is it playing out? I think for the most part is that they, the dollar, so Argentina as an example, if you want to buy a house there, you better have dollars. Certainly when Argentina's government borrows, it borrows in dollars because no one would lend to it in pesos. So that would be the first thing. I'll add to it that people say, well, deficits cause and government borrowing causes inflation. Well, that's very backwards, because what it implies is that people will lend to a government that's on the verge of devaluing. Well, no, they won't. Why would they do? Why would they hand over dollars, hand over some currency in return for a claim on an income stream in that currency that's going to be in decline? I mean, and I say this to Jeffrey and the Austrian crowd all the time. What you guys argue doesn't just say that markets are stupid, but it says that markets are ferociously stupid. The U.S. has massive amounts of debt. Why aren't we hyperinflating? Well, the surest sign we're not hyperinflating is all the debt, because a government that hyperinflates, no one's going to lend to it. My next book out is coming out on debt. It will come out in the spring, but I'm just staggered by how ridiculous everyone's being.
So I loved the now late P.J. O'Rourke. I don't know if you've read.
Oh yeah,
stuff. So the book that I wish, if I ever come up with the Bach Foundation, somehow come into money, whatever, or earn some more, is to put this in like every middle school, and then actually have the teachers read it, and then actually find teachers who would espouse it, because it's a book called Eat the Rich. And he, at the time, probably 20x years ago, 20, 25 years ago, he goes country to country, and kind of decides whether the countries are doing well. He hangs out for a month in each, and I don't know, like for example, I think Albania, he's at Hong Kong, I think it's pre-China takeover, and a number of other places. I think Tanzania, maybe Chile, I don't remember, but there's like 6 or so, maybe 8 places he goes to, and what he finds is, the example that really stuck with me was that Hong Kong had like no natural resources. It's sitting on the edge of communist China, potential adversary. And this is again before the merger or takeover, and hugely prosperous. And Tanzania has every single bit of wealth you'd like. Got great beaches, huge land, lots of room to spread, low real estate prices. They have, the same British colonial Commonwealth history, so they're using the same language. And they've got gold, they got uranium, they got oil, they got whatever, great weather, all this kind of stuff. And Hong Kong has, maybe some of the weather, but whatever, like no resources. And which one's wealthier? Obviously, it's Tanzania. Well, no. And so why is that? And so he does things like, looks at the duration of time it takes to get a business license. You want to open, John's, burger store. In Hong Kong, it's like costs you, $2 and 2 minutes. And in Tanzania, it costs you, maybe the same $2, but it costs you 2 years to get this thing, because you have probably more than $2, because you have to kind of baksheesh your way through all different kinds of tiny little fiefdoms and so forth to get your license. And he talks about basically the regulatory barriers in these various places. And I think he's in Albania also. And I think this kind of this wealth creation has to do with generally wealth creation is only through trading, and the ease with which you can trade and open your trade and make things better through kind of resource reallocation and knowledge exchange for the kind of the Adam Smithian virtuous circle. The better you're going to do. I don't know if that speaks to the inflation aspect, but
inflation's currency. But currency is crucial because currency is just a measure. It's a foot, it's a minute, it's a tablespoon, whatever it is that allows us to move goods together. So in my book about money, it begins with the Burj Al Khalifa and also the Japanese snow monkey, to show the snow monkeys fight with each other for a limited pie. The Burj Al Khalifa is a consequence of people working together around the world. And so stable money is an essential driver of trading. And that's why the dollar circulates globally, because people will not use, again, the Austrians have this vision of central banks shoving money into the economy. Oh, please. It's the opposite. Good money circulates where there's trade. By the surest sign that Germany's economy didn't collapse during the 1920s was the existence of dollars. Had it collapsed, dollars would not have been there. Dollars are an effect of production. And I'm merely, when I fight this inflation narrative that our side is using to get all over the Fed when they should be blaming politicians for shutting down the global economy, I say, stop it. The quickest path to lower prices, which is not deflation, is people working together. The quickest path to higher prices, which is similar, is not inflation, is people not working together. Instead, we've turned it into a Fed thing, which is what Austrians always do. And it's what so many people on the right always do. They focus on some central bank instead of recognizing that when people can't work together, prices go up. And you can't shut down a global economy and expect prices to be back where they were.
Fair enough. Well, I appreciate that. So we've more than rounded the hour. We're around the hour and more. I'd like to give you kind of final thoughts, and I'm going to spend a minute and pull up your book as well.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's so rare to get a chance to talk with someone as smart as you, who's interested in these ideas and what we're doing right now. I mean, look at this. You're in Boston. I'm down in Washington, D.C. We're having this discussion. This is a consequence of free trade, of people working together on the way to more and more advances. And so, never let people, hopefully everyone remembers this. This is primarily what I write about, that free people working together do amazing things. And in 2020, my book about the lockdowns, when politicians panicked, they robbed us of the very progress, which is what free people working together do in pursuit of safety from a virus. It would be hard to imagine a worse way to address what some people said was a crisis, taking away freedom. Free people achieve enormous things. They took it from us because politicians panicked.
Well, I very much appreciate that. I commend people to find you on Real Clear Markets. Are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter too. Not, but yeah. So I'm doing it all. I'll also be emailing you for Doctor. I need you down in DC. I need someone whom you trust, who's as contrarian as you are. I'm desperate because I don't ever want to get sick and have to put myself in the care of someone who doesn't think like you do. So
Well, I appreciate that. You know, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any big, deep, dark secrets. I'm not sure if people lived longer under my care, but we had a good time. You know, I people, I actually, for full disclaimer, I was suspended from my practice of medicine in 2014. So I had a primary care practice in Revere for 27 years, and for the kind of the from the mid 2000s to 2014 or so, I was running on the side, or ancillary to my practice, a narcotic detox, and I didn't see narcotic addiction as a disease. That was one of my standard precepts. It's a bad thing. It's an addiction, maybe like a trauma, like breaking your hip's not a disease, but it can kill you, as we were mentioning before. And along the way, a narcotic addict he didn't like me because I didn't give him what he wanted, et cetera. I don't want to get too far into it, but he made some stuff up that made it sound like I was an ogre. And I'm kind of a guy who stops at yellow lights practically. I clean the neighborhood when I walk my dog and whatnot. It's like, I pick up trash. I don't know. I'm not the best person on earth, but I try to be a better person than my default position might be. Anyway, but because I'm a conservative kind of guy, and I didn't see addiction as a disease. I presented a target for the board, and they went after me. And it's kind of, I see it as a kind of medical free speech thing. I had a case docket at the Supreme Court this year, but they didn't pick it up. But we tried to use the Sherman Act to point out that the boards, in a sense, are market agents. They were protecting, because I was threatening, in a sense, the methadone maintenance model. And I had a book out, and I showed them the book at the time. That basically it's all kind of the diseasification of many things, but including this, narcotic addiction. We don't, and part of, because it's economic, and I don't want to bore you too much, but it's maybe interesting in this sense, because doctors can write, and we have they have the sinecure, the rent seeking, the rent sought right to write narcotics, and we don't have that for alcohol. So lo and behold, if you're an alcoholic, we tell you to sober up. And if you're a narcoholic, we tell you, here's some medicine, that's going to replace it. So we don't have replacement vodka. If you have a whiskey problem, we don't give you vodka. If you have a sex addiction, we don't give you hookers. If you have a cocaine problem, we don't, go get you some blow. We don't do any of that. But if you have a narcotic problem, we put you on methadone, or now Suboxone, pretty much ad infinitum, and add college fund to the doctors. And so, that was kind of my mindset, but obviously I, saw people on the individual basis, and I gave people, I like to say the great philosopher Goldilocks. I thought the maintenance was too long and the detoxes were too short. So I given people like 3 or 4 months to kind of, taper down with it, relatively symptom free. Anyway, so I just want to put it out there that, my medical, before you buy into everything, you should have caveat, emptor, and understand where I come from. But, as far as my medical practice, nobody really complained about that. But, we had a lot of good times because, I'm kind of an explainer, I'm an analogy guy. And I think that, people, see doctors, and so much of it, I've been seeing doctors myself, as I get older. And, I find that doctors, a lot of times these days, they treat to the medical chart. And so they are economic agents, and they have to fill out a certain number of, little, dialogue boxes and radio buttons, or whatever they're called, on their charts. And so I have the doctors facing the computer screen, such as I'm doing now, but at least I'm talking with you. And I suppose I should try to get on Zoom with the doctors while they're doing the chart. But they have their backs to you. It's like it's crazy world, and they could actually figure out a better way to do it. I mean, I had medical charts and EMRs and all that kind of stuff when I was treating, EHRs. And I would just take notes and then dictate it later, because it's not that hard. And the real concourse, the real moment is to see the patient and assess the patient. There's really no finer medical tool. We have stethoscopes and ultrasounds or whatever, but most of it's this kind of like quick interaction, not only what is going on in the person, but what the person's own particular kind of, in a sense, economic value system about what you are saying and how they react to it. You can have, 10 people with 10 different colds, and some people are worried they're going to die, and some people are worried they're going to give it to the kids. Some people are worried that they just want to get out of work. They need it, so people, I did immigration exams, and people would come in with, a number of illnesses. They didn't want to talk about any of them because they wanted their immigration exam. So people have, interests. And I think that it's important, I don't think I wouldn't have necessarily an economist on staff doing it, but, clearly you have to be, willing to understand that interface that's happening between the person and his own illness. And I think there's a big break in medicine now, and a lot of it's, kind of command economy, top down stuff we saw during COVID. And people are, they're really, are willing to abdicate their own kind of personal agency role in medicine to be part of the team and to just kind of go along to get along, get paid. And that's, kind of the corporatization we saw in medicine. And it kind of, it's not just medicine, it's a lot of other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, it worries me. It worries because I want the oddballs in there. I want the Dostoevsky.
Yeah, no, it's good luck. And maybe, I think it'll actually happen, but it'll happen through other means. I think it's a little bit like colleges. They're out there, but they're not necessarily going to be upended as colleges. They're going to be upended through the YouTubeization, getting just in time knowledge that you kind of hint at and really bring up the fact that you don't need to know these telephone numbers. You don't need to know 12 languages. You don't need to know all kinds of encyclopedic information because you can find other means. I think medicine will maybe topple a little bit like the Soviet Union through just other means. It'll just kind of be decentralized and whatnot because the knowledge is out there. I mean, people will find out other ways of doctoring themselves and or finding other kind of formats and ways of grading how well they're doing, because they're happy doing the stuff they're happy doing. And I mean, that's my greatest hope. It's kind of, about the McDonald's rule of war, I assume, no two countries with the McDonald's have fought each other. I think that's probably been abrogated since. But, this kind of like Nintendo theory, where people have their games, they're more, they're happier, they're quieter, they, less violent. We've seen a lot of violence in the world. So hopefully we'll come to some solution. And part of it's going to be through medicine. I'm going to just, pop this up for our viewers. If you want to help support my video cast and get excellent, amazing, intelligent, brilliant, clairvoyant economist types such as John Tamny on my show, you can buy my book. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. This doesn't really get talked about that much. It's been overshadowed by COVID, but take my word for it. It's a fascinating story because, frankly, it's something I never thought I'd write about if I were going to be writing, but it kind of puzzled me that this came and went, and people really don't talk about why Zika doesn't cause any microcephaly anymore. And so buy the book at the very least, and if you have time, read it as well. Spread the word, and thank you so much, John. Any final words?
Thank you so much. This is what a treat. I've kept you on too long, but thank you so much. I'm so glad to have come on.
All right, thank you so much.